third dimension with its own brain, its own voice, its own legs. There's only one problem. It needs your eyes. Virtual Boy. See it now in 3D.
It's hard to believe, but Nintendo first dabbled with virtual reality 25 years ago to this day. That's right, on July 21st, 1995, the Virtual Boy came out in Japan. It came out in the US just a little bit later, sometime in August. So we're here to celebrate the 25th anniversary of its Japanese release. And we're joined by Neil Ronaham from Nintendo World Report as one of the few in the world who also owns a Virtual Boy. So Neil, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. We're a dying race. Although I will say, I guess I'll be out with it now. I wasn't there on day one. Definitely played demos of it in like in a JCPenney or a Sears, maybe. I forget, some box store in a mall. I know I spent time playing Mario's Tennis there.
Right.
But I was a later adopter. But I've got my nice little dozen game collection, which equates to like more than half of the entire lineup on the system. And I would consider myself a Virtual Boy stan at heart, even if the system failed for a reason. But I kind of love it.
I totally get that. Like, I was revisiting it just before this discussion. I'm like, oh my god, I remember now why this thing just failed horribly. But at the same time, I have a soft spot for it. Like, I appreciate what it was doing and how in some ways it was so far ahead of the game. Like, virtual reality is just now finally becoming a thing, and Nintendo was trying to do it 25 years ago, and to be fair, they weren't the only ones. In fact, arguably they were late to the game back in the 90s, where virtual reality seemed to be everywhere. But they weren't able to, no one was able to quite make it work back then. So yeah, I thought it'd be fun for us to look back at the Virtual Boy 25 years later, see what worked, see what didn't, discuss everything we can about it. Because yeah, I too, as you were saying, as I just said, like I too have like a weird fondness for the system, because it is just such a weird oddity in so many respects, whether it's the design or the fact that Nintendo just dropped it entirely after just a few months. It didn't even break 1 million in sales. It sold 770,000 units worldwide, which is pitiful. That is god-awful. Anyways, I'm kind of getting way ahead of myself here. I want to go back real quick, back in time to before the Virtual Boy came out. Where were you at when it was releasing, and do you remember being excited for it at the time? Do you remember, like, what was your thought process? Was it something you wanted back when the Virtual Boy was being announced and, released?
It was definitely something that I would have. I don't think I had a Nintendo Power subscription back in the early '90s, but I definitely through other friends. I mean, it's me being slightly on the younger side. Like I would have been 7 years old when it came out.
Yeah,
but I definitely seen hype for it, and like I said, I've gone into in a shopping mall. Remember when we could go to those? I've been inside shopping malls, like playing Virtual Boy demos sometime in the summer of 1995, and I do have a vivid memory of that. I didn't have any friends that owned the system, so like it kind of came and went very quickly. Then like it kind of was, Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo time was still going around then. PlayStation was emerging, although I don't think I was really that aware of PlayStation. I was very much embroiled in the Nintendo versus Sega wars in the mid-90s as a single-digit kid. But by the time the Nintendo 64 came out in 1996, the Virtual Boy was gone, and I kind of just forgot about it. It was out of sight, out of mind. And as I got deeper into the internet and Nintendo and video games, that's when I started going back and longing for this mythical beast that I never had experienced. Reading about Wario Land. When I started learning about Atlas games, about how I'm 99% sure that Jack Bros is the first Atlas Shin Megami Tensei game that came to America. I think it's either the first or the second, but it's Jack Bros. As I learned about Atlas games and their universe, I was like, man, I'd love to play that game. And then Mario Clash always seemed kind of neat. I didn't play that until years later. Nestor's Funky Bowling. Harold and who didn't love Harold and Nestor back in that age, and they actually made a game with him. It's so cool.
The Nintendo Power Mascot, and this was before they even before his doppelganger, I guess actually is him, appeared in Pilotwings 64. He had his own game on the Virtual Boy, which was pretty fun. So you were aware of it, but you kind of had ignored it until you picked it up at some point later.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it's definitely. I mean, I was at an age I didn't really control my money, so even if I wanted it, like it would have been like, you already have a Game Boy. Why do you need the weird, like Red Boy? Yeah. But it's even thinking about it, like historically, I don't even think Virtual Boy was a thing Nintendo wanted to release publicly, or at least because Gunpei Yokoi, who famed Nintendo toy maker, because he predates them being in video game consoles. He like made the Ultra Hand and stuff like that,
and of course the Game & Watch and Game Boy as well.
Yeah, like Game & Watch was Yokoi, like that was his thing, and he also was instrumental behind the Game Boy, and was, I think, tinkering around with the Virtual Boy.
Right.
And he was probably, I think he was late 50s, early 60s. Like he wound up retiring from Nintendo. There was some, like, it was a disgraced firing, but I think that's all hearsay.
Right.
Because I believe his dismissal at Nintendo after that was like, he did kind of, it was probably a little bit forced out because of the failure of the Virtual Boy, but very much more he retired, because I think he even like made like another, like, I think the Game Boy Pocket after this, before he left the company. But there's some quotes from him out there where he's basically just that, like, this wasn't ready to be launched, but the N64 kept on getting delayed, and at that point, from when this came out in 1995, Nintendo hadn't released a new console since the Super Nintendo, which would have been 1990 in Japan. So there was a long time, like, N64 was supposed to be out in 95. Or I think even before then. Like, I think optimistically, Nintendo 64 was supposed to be out near the PlayStation and the Saturn, and it just kept on getting delayed.
Yeah, that's a great point, and kind of to that point, I mean, the Virtual Boy was even marketed as a 32-bit system to compete with Saturn and PlayStation, even if it didn't really come anywhere close to approaching it in terms of graphic fidelity. And as you were saying too, from my research, they kind of just threw the Virtual Boy out there without being really market ready. Like, it wasn't meant to be released in the form it was, to my understanding, but they had to get it out the door, and that obviously, in hindsight, was a poor decision. But at the time, though, it did seem like Nintendo was going all in, at least Nintendo of America. I don't know how it was treated in Japan, but Nintendo of America did seem to be going all in on this with a pretty robust marketing campaign. I remember the ads for it looking pretty impressive and also terrifying, where one of the ads is like a Virtual Boy that's like treated as almost like a Terminator. It's like walking around in like a futuristic hellscape as a human's trying to run away from it, and it ropes it in with like its power cord, and the ad is like, it wants your eyes. I'm like, what the heck? Is this really like good marketing? But then also too,
90s marketing was wild.
It was so wild. Yeah, there's some even more insane Nintendo ads from that era. And then also, like, Nintendo Power, I know you missed it, but they actually had a really cool issue focused around the Virtual Boy where it came with, like, 3D glasses. I mean, it's something kids have seen before, like in cereal boxes or Cracker Jacks, probably. But it was fun to see Nintendo include something, and I believe they even offered, like, a preview of, like, an idea of how Virtual Boy games would look, because you can see the images actually pop off the page with that. So I'm like, hey, that's neat. So I wanted this. I wanted the Virtual Boy more than anything, because it was a new system from Nintendo. As you'd said, it'd been a while. The Game Boy at this point was already 6 years old, which feels like an eternity as a kid. And yeah, it's like something new. It's like, and it was exploring virtual reality. How freaking cool is that? But there's a parent factor. Video games weren't nearly as wide-reaching as they are now, and most parents, I don't think, played games back then, so this was very, child-focused. As a product, which is ironic because there's a giant warning on the box being like, hey, you have to be over 7 years old to play this. And I think, and parents, to their credit, I think intuitively understood, yeah, this is not a good platform to invest in. Partially because the price was $180 at launch in the US, which now doesn't sound horrible, but if you adjust for inflation, that's over $300 these days.
Yeah, it's basically it's more than the price of a Switch.
Right, exactly. And yeah, even though it was a portable system, it barely was. It took 6 AA's, you had to set it up on a table, and I'm sure we'll have more to say about that soon. So yeah, needless to say, I didn't get one at launch. I remember playing it at Blockbuster, and because they had kiosks set up there. You could also rent one for like $10, and they'd give you 2 games for like 2 nights as well. So I remember playing a Blockbuster, and yeah, I don't remember what my thoughts were. I think I still remember thinking it was cool, while also underwhelming at the same time. So it wasn't until years later that I actually got a Virtual Boy myself, and the way I acquired it was because my friend's younger brother had one, hated it. He's like, hey Andre, do you want this? I've got 6 games of Virtual Boy, do you want it? I'll just give it to you for free. I'm like, are you serious? He's like, yeah, you can have it. I'm like, alright.
I wound up with so many Super Nintendo games that way, where people were just like, this is old, and I'm like, alright, sure.
Yeah, I'll take it. I actually gave him $5 for it. I'm like, sure, here's $5. But then, like I think I touched on earlier, I lost, I don't know where my Virtual Boy went, so I had to rebuy the darn thing about a year ago. $600 on Amazon, because I'm insane.
So I actually, like, on Facebook, I had the Facebook memory of being like, I bought a Virtual Boy AMA, because when I bought mine, it was right after I graduated college, and I was in that like post college graduate haze of like, I'm looking for a full-time job, and this is sad and depressing. What is the rest of my life going to be? I visited a friend out in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania. I'm trying to think of exactly, I don't know, somewhere like, it's probably 4 hours from Pittsburgh, 4 hours from Philly, just somewhere randomly in the middle of Pennsylvania, where a buddy of mine was like working there at a theater, and stopped by a used game shop, and I was out there for the weekend, and saw that they had a Virtual Boy, and I didn't have a lot of money, but I worked while I was in college, so I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna buy this Virtual Boy, whatever games this guy has. And I want to say I think I got it, and I know I definitely got Wario Land. I think Wario Land and Mario's Tennis were 2 of the games, and there might have been like 4 games and the system was in pretty good condition. I had the AC adapter, came with the battery pack. I think that was like at most $100.
Man, I got ripped off.
but then so there's all the weird stuff with it, because there's like there was a period of my life where I knew more about the technical, like how the Virtual Boy worked. But there's like these weird hacks that, like, I think there's glue that is on however it makes the visuals look, that will wear out over time, because like the adhesive that is used will kind of like break down sooner than the. So I mean, it's over 25 years. This might just happen.
Yeah.
So it's something where like you take out this film and you put it in the oven for a little bit, and then it melts it, and it kind of like reseals the adhesive.
This is reminding me of the Xbox 360 for some reason.
Yeah, where it'd just be like, I'm just gonna put a towel over it, it'll be fine. But I tried doing that, and I was like, oh no, I'm just gonna break it. So then there was like, it was someone being like, I can't test this, it's just a headset for a Virtual Boy. And I think it was like just like $30 plus shipping, and I was like, I'm just gonna buy this, so if I break the other one, then at least maybe this will work. And it actually does work. So I do have 2 working headsets, although one of them is like, it's like, it doesn't even have like the eye cushion part of it.
Oh, okay,
it was straight up just that. But like, I guess I have 2 Virtual Boy headsets if the world ever needs that.
Hey, I mean, that's useful. I mean, good luck finding spare parts in the future, so it's good to have a backup. No, it's funny you mentioned like, the fact that that it had these weird quirks, it seems, and part of it is because the system, as you kind of touched on, it has moving parts, which was definitely unusual for Nintendo back then. Like, all their hardware was like pretty solid state, no real moving parts beyond like power switches. The Virtual Boy was a weird exception though, because the way it handled its screens is that they weren't really even screens. The resolution was literally, if you just look at the hardware, the resolution for each eye is 1:224. One line, I think vertically, I think it's vertical, or maybe horizontal, I forget which, by 224. And the way it worked is because the meters actually vibrate at 50 hertz, fast enough that it actually makes it look like a full screen. So that screen's updating, 50 times a second. That looks like you're actually getting a full screen resolution. So you can actually hear and feel the buzzing every time you turn on the Virtual Boy. So I've had this Virtual Boy now, my second one, for a year now. I only unboxed it today for this discussion. I'm like, all right, here's a moment of truth. Are you actually going to work 25 years later? But it's used too. And sure enough, it turned on, worked perfectly. I'm like, oh, thank God. Because this thing feels so delicate too. It's a giant hunk of plastic. It sits atop an awkward tripod. In order to use it without killing yourself, you have to prop it up on the table. And if you like forget, I was using headphones with it. I was terrified of like getting up or getting there plugged in, but that thing would just topple over, fall to the floor, probably break instantly.
Yep. Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
That's part of the reason, like, I have it out, it's next to my TV in my office, and it's just because I'm like, where else do I even put it?
Right. Yeah.
Like, it's the kind of thing, like, yes, it is a great showpiece, had a lot of great conversations come out of being like, oh yes, that is a Virtual Boy, let us discuss it. Much like we are now. But it is like, it's also like, if I were to put it away, it's like all my Labo stuff. I'm like, okay, like, I don't need to have this house out, but like, what do I can't really store it anywhere. Like,
right. Yeah, it's such an awkward shape. Like, it's awkward size and shape. I mean, as I said earlier, it's a portable system, in quotes. It barely is. Just because it's so impractical to take anywhere with you. Especially given the setup you needed to use it. Like, even today, just trying to find a comfortable setup, well, for one, was impossible. But trying to find the least uncomfortable setup was difficult enough. So my question for you though, Neil, is when you finally got your hands on one of these on a Virtual Boy, do you remember what your impression was, or like what you thought of it? Like, did it surprise you?
It's a very brief novelty. Mm-hmm. I feel like I actually, going into a little bit more of when I got the Virtual Boy, it was shortly after E3 2010 when Nintendo showed off the 3DS.
Right.
And that was kind of like, oh, like they're making good on what the Virtual Boy, that would have been the 15th anniversary at that point. Around when that was announced. Mm-hmm. And that actually led to, I pitched a feature to OneUp.com back in the day, got my first freelance article there, nice. Kind of about how, like, the Virtual Boy could inform the 3DS. And I was reading over what Neil in 2010 said, and I can tell that I was way more impressed with it then than I am now. But part of that was because of the promise of the 3DS.
Right.
And, like, playing the Virtual Boy, it's kind of like, okay, like, I can see how 15 years later in something that's not awkward and gawky, like, this stuff could be really cool. And it also reminded me of how the 3DS kind of got rid of the 3D aspect of it over the course of its life as well. Like, Mario's Tennis, the depth in that game is really neat and awesome, and I don't even think Mario Tennis Open on 3DS even captured exactly how Mario's Tennis makes depth feel in that game. And like Mario Clash it's a super cool concept. Like, I love, even if Red Alarm being just red and black made it like Star Fox gibberish, like if you were to remove it from the fact that there are only two colors, Red Alarm's a really cool game. Like Galactic Pinball, like Samus makes a cameo in that. That's awesome.
Yeah, they were Metroid Pinball.
Yeah, like it's a really cool pinball game that makes really good use of that faux 3D effect. And there's a lot of games that they're all neat, but it feels like there's almost always a fatal flaw tying them down. Like Teleroboxer, they made Robot Punch-Out. It's just way too damn hard.
Right.
And Wario Land is probably the only game here that I would call like somewhat unimpeachable. Like, I think you could just take Wario Land as is, put it into like just not. It doesn't even need to be in 3D necessarily, and that would be a totally fine Wario game. Like, it wouldn't. I don't think it's not the peak of the series or anything, but Virtual Boy Wario Land's a solid game, and I think the tragedy with the Virtual Boy is I think that might be the only one that's truly like a game that would be fine if it was just on like a Game Boy instead of the Virtual Boy.
Yeah, you're kind of touching on a few points there. I think the Virtual Boy, say what you will about the actual quality of the games, it had a really just unique set of games. Like, every game you listed off, they all feel very distinct for the platform. Like, there aren't really too many games similar to a lot, or maybe not similar, but like quite in the same essence that those games captured, you know? Mario Clash was effectively a sequel to Mario Brothers, and we haven't really seen that since. There's a 3D Tetris game, and by that I mean not Tetris in 3D, I mean a completely redesigned idea of Tetris inside like a well. Red Alarm, as touched on, is almost a little bit Star Fox 2-like, but in having this like free roaming landscape.
Yeah.
But again, Star Fox 2 didn't come out, so it had that to its own. Nestor's Funky Bowling, and then as you were saying, Wario Land. I actually just played for the first time today. I bought that I think at the same time I rebought Virtual Boy, and this game is legit great. I would not say there's been another Virtual Boy game that's actually great until Wario Land. This game is really freaking good, and actually it's probably one of the few that actually makes really good use of the depth perception, For most of the other games I've played, it feels subtle, and maybe that's one of the problems. It doesn't really stand out that much. It's just kind of something that's there. But with Wario Land, it works because everything has a very clear division, right? You got the foreground, you got the background, which you hop between, and it's the interplay between those two that's really fun, with how enemies will pop up in the background to the foreground. Even the first boss, I played up just a little bit past that point, throws like a spiked ball at the screen. It actually made me blink. Like, actually, like, it frightened me a little bit. I'm like, dang, that's actually really cool. Yeah.
But now I want to go back and play Virtual Boy Wario Land. Yeah. Like, it's a good game. Like, and Jack Bros. Jack Bros is like the mythical beast that I've never actually played, but that's like a top-down, like, I don't know if it's got roguelike things to it, but it's like a top-down shooter of sorts, where you're like dungeon crawler, where you play as like the Jack Frost and those characters from the Shin Megami Tensei games, which I believe, and I should have totally double-checked this, I think Jack Bros is the first Mega 10 game that ever came out in America.
Oh, wow.
And that's a game that, like, I have yet to play, but it by all accounts, it's good. And then, like, there's... Yeah, I'm just trying to think of other games, like Nestor's Funky Bowling exists. It's a bowling game that has Nestor in it.
I had fun with it at the time. I don't think it holds... I don't know if it holds up or not. I didn't try it today. But I did quickly revisit most of my library of games, which I don't think I've said yet. So the ones I have owned, or at least I don't know if I still own them. I don't know if they're all here, but the ones I have, I think, are Mario's Tennis, Mario Clash. I think I have 3D Tetris. Not sure about that one. Galactic Pinball, Panic Bomber, Red Alarm, Nestor's Funky Bowling, and Wario Land, as I said, is my most recent acquisition. And most of those, I popped in for a few minutes, I played enough, I'm like, alright, yep, this is about what I remember, I don't need to play much more of this. Wario Land, I invested 40 minutes into, and I wanted to play more. And which says something, because the Virtual Boy that I kind of commented on earlier is not a comfortable experience. I started off playing, I have like a little stool, I propped it up on like a little ottoman I have, and God, that was horrible. That was killing my back. Again, you have to like lean into the Virtual Boy. And so I moved it later. I moved it to like a counter I have, which has space underneath for my legs. I just rolled my like desk chair over there, and that was a lot better, but it still sucked. My upper back was like on fire by the time I was done with Wario Land. But the fact that I put up with it for that long really says something. It's 40 minutes in Virtual Boy is like 5 hours doing like heavy lifting in the real world.
Yeah, I think pretty much what you listed, I have familiarity with all those. Yeah, the one that I think I might have, or the two that I have that I don't think you mentioned, Teleraboxer, which, yeah, it really is, it's just Robot Punch-Out, but they made it incredibly hard. And the cool thing about that, and the weird thing about the Virtual Boy, is that there's 2 D-pads on it. It's basically like, you could maybe say it's got similarities to like a N64 controller in design a little bit.
Well,
but
I would even equate it to dual analog sticks. It was kind of ahead of the game.
Yeah, because you have those 2 D-pads that are on it, and then you have, like an A and a B button, and I believe there's a start button as well. But like that works out for Teleraboxer because basically each D-pad controls a hand, or like an arm. So that's how you do your different punches, is like by doing like, the left hand, or your left arm is the left D-pad, your right arm's the right D-pad, and you can do like different combos from that as well. I also have Virtual League Baseball, which is hot garbage, but the neat thing about Teleraboxer and Virtual League Baseball is I was able to find them completely brand new in shrink wrap 15 years after they came out.
Wow, that's impressive.
I believe there is an article on Nintendo Report from like 2010 or 2011 where I unboxed Teleraboxer.
Oh, nice.
Because I bought it on eBay and I was like, well, this is like really dumb. Like I might as well do something with it. And yeah, it was a sealed copy of Teleraboxer.
I mean that's kind of how I felt today, like opening my second Virtual Boy. And, I'm like, I better do something with this. I bought it a year ago randomly. I was kind of on a VR kick, because of, like, the whole Nintendo Labo thing, the whole Labo VR, more specifically. And I'm like, oh, it'd be fun to revisit Nintendo's, like, first foray into virtual reality, which could also be looked at as their second foray into 3D, because there was that NES 3D glasses thing that they made. Yeah, there's like the Famicom, the Famicom Rally game, which I think the second one is in 3D. That's like proto Mario Kart. Yeah, exactly. So this was kind of, in a way, like an evolution of that, and as you said earlier, a precursor to the 3DS. And it was kind of fun. I mean, it is fun to see what they were going for. Like, they were trying to create this really immersive experience with the Virtual Boy, and in many respects, it's pretty similar to modern day headsets, in that there's like the eye border, or the, you know, as you mentioned, the part you're missing, like the little mesh around the screen that kind of blocks out the outside world. You're staring into two separate displays. You can wear like headphones for ultimate immersion. Nintendo advertised as being, you know, like this super immersive thing, but it was also like held back in many ways too, some of which you've already touched on. There's a fact that it had, you know, the display was purely black and red, which in some respects was kind of cool, because one of the neat things, I mean, it's cool as a side effect, but one of the neat things is that there's no clear boundary around the screen. It has like a perfect black display when it's not displaying red. And that's kind of neat, and that's part of the inspiration behind Galactic Pinball, which takes place in space, is it kind of feels like, you know, the
emptiness.
Exactly, yeah, it kind of exists in space. And that's, I think the quote from the developer was, like, it presents as infinite space beyond the playfield. And yeah, that's kind of neat when it works. It works less you know, it's not as impressive in other games where there is a clear frame, even in Wario Land, which I like, but you know, it looks like you're staring at a screen that's probably 6 inches ahead of you. And that's kind of one thing that surprised me going back to the Virtual Boy, is from playing both like Labo VR and also the Oculus Quest, is just how small the display is by today's standards. Like, Nintendo presented it as like this whole immersive world. We look at it, it's like, oh, it looks like I'm looking at my phone from about 6 inches away, you know? It's not as impressive. And then there's the fact too, of course, unlike modern virtual reality, there's no head tracking here at all. Nintendo apparently, I think, had considered it, but for multiple reasons, including, I think, motion sickness, they decided against it. And in fact, I remember reading, and I think it was Nintendo Magic, there was even a quote from them, I think it was from Nintendo Magic, a book, where they were saying...
That's a great book, by the way.
Oh, fantastic
I'm looking at it right now on my shelf. I've thought about rereading it, so maybe I will, and I'll let you know.
Maybe you can verify my quote then. But they were even afraid of like kids like running out of traffic or something while wearing a headset on their head. So that's all part of the reason why the Virtual Boy is in the awkward shape it is, on a tripod, no motion sensing. And as for the red display, it was cheaper, the batteries lasted longer, and according to Nintendo Power, it cost 3 times as much if it had a color display. But for the issues Nintendo was trying to solve, it's also kind of like what was like the Virtual Boy's undoing, because it didn't do anything well enough to warrant putting up with its hassles. You know, for as much as like Virtual or Wario Land, by and large, the library of games here aren't enhanced enough by the Virtual Boy's form factor to be worth, for one, to invest so much money in, and two, put up with the annoyance of playing the Virtual Boy.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. Like, Wario Land is the only game that I would recommend people go back and play.
It's great.
Like, there's a curiosity factor to the system, and I think if you've ever wanted to play it, like, find a friend that you can borrow it from.
Exactly.
Because I don't know if it's worth the $600 that you paid for it last year.
Definitely not. I'm a fool. I'm not gonna make my money back.
Everybody share this video, so that way Andre can not feel bad about spending $600 on the Virtual Boy.
Appreciate that.
But it's a wild system, and there is a part of me, especially kind of looking back at it with the context of hindsight and looking at like what could have been. There was a robust plan to like relaunch the system in 1996 with a couple of games that, if you get into the emulation scene, you can actually find. Mm-hmm. There's a game. How much, Andre? Do you know that much about like basically the games that got canceled that were pretty
like
far
the
along?
F-Zero game?
Yeah, Zero Racers. But Bound High it's like a action puzzle game where you're controlling a ball that's kind of like in the background are like different things that you can hit, and the ball will bounce in the air towards the foreground towards you. That game is essentially done. That was the one that was basically like, this is going to be the first game out for the relaunch. That ROM is floating around there. There are a number of other games.
That's a Star Fox 2 a Virtual Boy?
Yeah, pretty much. Like Bound High, I don't even know what the emulation scene is with the Virtual Boy these days, but you can play that game if you really want to. There's a whole lot of other stuff, like Zero Racers you mentioned, which is going to be an F-Zero sequel where you're flying through space.
Yeah, it looks like you're in a tube. And you have it seems like you have full 3D control, right? Like over.
Yeah. It almost looks like it's the Star Wars trench run. Like, that's what it looks like.
Exactly.
And that game, I think, was pretty far along in development, because that was supposed to be, there was this plans for this 1996 relaunch, and it was going to be Bound High, Zero Racers, and then this game Dragon Hopper that was made by Intelligent Systems, which we know as, I mean, most recently, Intelligent Systems made Paper Mario: The Origami King, but back in that era, they would have been working on a lot of portable projects, but like that's, you know, Intelligent Systems working on Fire Emblem and Advance Wars, although we did not know of them yet.
Right.
But they made Dragon Hopper, which is basically like a weird Zelda-style game where, like, you're the big hook to it was that the dragon could hop, and you would basically like be jumping up and down between floors, almost like a Link Between Worlds.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the bummer about the whole Virtual Boy, being a failure, is that we missed out on what else could have been, because it did seem like we were getting different types of games that we haven't seen a whole lot of since. Like, even revisiting Wario Land again, because that game really is fun from what I've played. There's ideas in that game I haven't seen Nintendo explore much of yet. Like, I mean, that's the type of gameplay I expected from Mario on 3DS, but they didn't even explore that at all. We've seen similar things in a couple of Mario games, like Yoshi's Island had some background interaction, and then even Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door had you traveling between layers, but none of them worked on quite the level that Wario Land did. And I think it's a bummer that we're not seeing, that we never got some of these kind of weird spin-offs or weird versions of Nintendo games that were only being made on the Virtual Boy. Even beyond the canceled Zero Racers, there was also plans for evidently GoldenEye, which is going to be like a driving game or something.
Yeah, because I think GoldenEye, I don't think the developer for that was known, but there was basically just like, there was some like marketing thing where it was like, it's an action racing game, get ready, it's GoldenEye.
Right.
Which, that would have been weird. Yeah, and then Rare worked on Donkey Kong Country 2.
Right?
A Virtual Boy.
I would have loved to
They
have
didn't
seen
get
that.
very far. This like came out like a year or two ago. I think it was from a Digital Foundry video, because I just wanted to double check my work on that one. But yeah, like Rare was starting to work on porting Donkey Kong Country 2 to Virtual Boy. But then like basically like after a month or two, Nintendo was like, nah, stop.
Exactly.
I think the game that I would have loved to have seen is the Virtual Boy Mario Land game.
Yes!
That there was a lot of that shown pre-release, and I think what happened is that parts of it kind of morphed into Wario Land, and other parts of it kind of warped into Mario Clash, but I think there were plans to do a Virtual Boy Mario Land game at some point, and that would have had... I mean, it would have had some of the same tricks as Wario Land on paper, but it also had, you would go down a pipe, and there were, like, top-down Zelda dungeons.
Oh, wow.
Like, it just seems wild. Like, it's... Especially in an area when Nintendo has been so safe with 2D Mario for decades.
Isn't that the truth?
It's so weird of them, like, seeing, like, oh yeah, like, you were gonna go down a pipe, and then just, like, it was... like you were gonna solve a Zelda puzzle or something and then go back into 2D Mario. It was basically like the inverse of Link's Awakening.
Right. Yeah, that sounds so fun. That sounds like such a neat idea to explore, you know, something different before they got really safe with the new Super Mario Brothers games. Because like you look at New Super Mario Brothers 2 on the DS, it barely took advantage of the 3D. I remember even speculating in an analysis video, whenever, I think our first one actually, when they first showed off screenshots of the game before we even saw it in action. I speculated, hey, maybe you'll be able to jump between the foreground and background, because it kind of looked like you might be able to at points. Was I wrong? And I wish I had explored that. And speaking of the 3DS, though, like I was so hoping that they would use that as an opportunity to re-release Virtual Boy games, like in color, like bring back Wario Land on the 3DS. Like it's such a great game that almost no one's had the chance to play, because it's impossible to, let alone in its intended form in 3D.
I mean, like, listen, the Game Gear wasn't that great either, and we got a bunch of Virtual Console Game Gear games on the 3DS. Why couldn't we have done that for Virtual Boy as well? Like, it's such a missed opportunity, and I just feel like at this point, we're never gonna see it. Like, 3DS was the chance to bring back Virtual Boy in a way that, you know, would be a little bit more celebratory and not so much like, remember when we made a huge mistake? Yeah. And all we got out of it was like the Tomodachi Life gag, like that was it. And then, but then in in Labo VR. There's a video where it's like, look, you're going to see Mario's Tennis, and I'm like, why can't I play this game?
I love
how
that.
cool would that have been if I could have played Mario's Tennis in Labo VR?
They were so close. I know. I saw that video. I'm like, oh, that's awesome that they referenced it, but why can't I play it? You know, that would have been so fun that they had incorporated something to that degree. Yeah, Labo VR seems like a perfect fit for Virtual Boy. And finally, in its fully, you know, I think almost in Virtual Boy's final form, you can actually, you know, fully immerse yourself within these games. You did mention something that reminded me of something I wanted to bring up. You mentioned the Game Gear, and what's really funny is Reflection Technology, the company that developed the technology for the Virtual Boy, the screen-based technology, apparently had shown this technology to Sega as well, who declined it on account of the fact that it used a single color display and they had concerns about motion sickness. So Nintendo, what were you thinking? If Sega turns down the product, that should be your first warning sign. Anyways, I guess with Sega having the Game Gear, they couldn't go back from that to a single color, right? Whereas,
yeah. Whereas, I mean, the Virtual Boy was pitched as a successor to the Game Boy,
right,
and like
it.
I mean, in a way, it was very much like a baby step, because I think on a technical level, like, it can't really do much more than what a Game Boy can. It's just, instead of being, you know, monochromatic in the way that a Game Boy was, I guess it was two-color. Like, you could do red and black.
It's still the same, or rather, it's still 4 shades. Game Boy 4 shades of gray, Virtual Boy has 4 shades of red, which can be a bit problematic in, like, Red Alarm, where everything's a wireframe. It's sometimes hard to tell what's a wall or not. Like, is that space or is that a wall?
That's the thing. It's like Red Alarm is a game that I actually think would be a very good game, not on the Virtual Boy, because the mechanics are fun. It's just that, like, you can't tell what's a wall and what isn't.
A few other things I want to point out real quick about the Virtual Boy is, as you kind of touched on earlier, the controller is actually pretty unique and is, I would say, kind of forward-thinking in a few ways. I think it's the first Nintendo console to have handles preceding the Nintendo 64. It had dual D-pads, as we kind of mentioned earlier, which is similar to dual analog sticks, and they had it for the reason of, like, being able to control games in a 3D space, although there were actually very few of those. Most games were more 2D in nature. It had triggers as well, again, beating the Nintendo 64 with its Z button. It had 2 triggers, in fact. And then also, it arguably kind of started the Mario Sports line of games. It launched, in the US at least, had a pack-in of Mario's Tennis. It's possessive.
Yeah, because to that point, okay, you did kind of have, like, NES Open Tournament Golf, which was, like, kind of a Mario game, but Mario's name wasn't on it. Mario's Tennis was the first sports game to be, like, I guess unless you count Mario Kart, which, like, that's up for debate.
Yeah.
Like, Mario Kart's kind of its own thing, other than, you know, golf and tennis and everything. But yeah, and then Mario's Tennis kind of kicked off into Mario Tennis on N64, and then Mario Golf. It started here.
Yeah, it did. And that was I think that was a pretty smart pack-in game, despite the fact that Virtual Boy failed. I think it was going to fail no matter what. But Mario Tennis made it, you know, as you mentioned earlier, it offered a pretty good sense of depth, particularly with the ball flying right at you. And even going back to it, I really, you know, I thought it made a few smart choices with how, like, it had a lower camera angle, kind of puts it more into the action. And the fact that they were able to, you know, just have the outline of the court really added to the, as we mentioned, like the fact that the screen isn't that big. It kind of made it feel bigger because you can't really see the edges of this world for the most part. So yeah, it was a really smart pack-in game. Now, Mario Clash, on the other hand, for as much as I appreciate it, as a sequel to Mario Brothers, I just don't think this one's that good, honestly.
It's one of those games where the idea of it is way better than the execution, because it is neat where it's like, oh, instead of, like, you know, looping up to the top of the screen, you're looping to the back of the screen. Like, that idea is really cool, but it doesn't really build to anything.
Right.
Because correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, it's been a while since I played it, and you played it earlier today. You can just pick whatever stage you play at, and it's just kind of like, there's no really sense of progression in that game, which I guess does build off of the arcade nature of the original game, but it's not as fun because I'm not going to anything. Like, it's just like, this is the game.
Yeah, that's it. It's pretty simple. It's neat as a novelty for a few levels, but once you get over that, there's not a whole lot of value to it, and the 3D is not even particularly impressive either. I think it's because like the sense of depth is so gradual, like how the warp pipes extend to the distance and how the screen doesn't move at all. It's completely stationary. It's just not a very good showcase for the system. And there's one major problem with this game, Neil. I don't know how Nintendo screwed this up, but jump is mapped to B and not A as it should be. It's completely backwards. I don't know how they screwed it up, and I was relieved when I popped in Wario Land afterwards. I'm like, oh, thank God, Nintendo realized the error of their ways. Jump is on the right button here. So, yeah, it's kind of wild to me that Labo VR came out almost a quarter of a century after Virtual Boy. Nintendo ignored VR I mean, it depends if you look at the 3DS as a form of VR. Like, it had 3D. But they didn't try to experiment with VR until a quarter of a century later again, which is just wild to me. And yeah, I guess my question to you is, do you think Nintendo will do anything more with VR? Or do you think Labo VR is kind of the end of the road for it for a while?
I feel like with the Switch, Labo VR might be as far as it goes, but in the future, I mean, it's the kind of thing with Nintendo. You even look at like kind of the march to the 3DS in a way. Is there's the early stuff on Famicom. There's the Virtual Boy. There's the experiments of like making Luigi's Mansion in 3D on GameCube, and then eventually they released a console in the 3DS that kind of like the technology caught up with their ideas in a way. And I feel like with Labo VR existing, that means there's a team at Nintendo that has played with VR. And I know you're a lot more higher on Labo VR than I am.
I love it.
Like it's like your game of the year from the other year.
Heck yeah.
But it's a really neat idea, but it feels more tech demo-y than it does feel like a full realization of it. And I would love to see that team or another team at Nintendo kind of go farther with that. Like make it where instead of it being something appended onto Breath of the Wild, make a full Zelda game that takes VR into account. Like, that would be awesome. But I guess to get back to your question, will that happen? I don't think we're gonna see much more on Switch. But the future, it could be something that maybe their next system isn't going to be built around it, but maybe their next system will be better equipped to fit whatever VR need they want. I do think they are onto something with using Labo VR, like the cardboard as a headset, because it solves a problem that I think some of the VR kits have. It's just that then it creates another one by the fact that the resolution generally isn't as good as the other VR headsets.
Right.
But it does make it where like it's a lot more approachable than going to one of the other VR headsets. As someone, I'm fascinated by the technology. I haven't bought, I mean, I've thought about an Oculus Quest every now and then, or maybe a PSVR will finally be in the price range that I'm willing to spend on it. But Labo VR was an easier purchase because it's like, I think what it was, $80 at launch.
Yeah, like, for the whole thing. Yeah, for everything.
Yeah, for a gamble, that's fine. But then, the Virtual Boy being $180 at launch, the equivalent of over $300 after inflation. That's what you're looking at more with those headsets. And yeah, they've come a lot further than the Virtual Boy ever did. But it's still like I feel like I'm putting out money for something that's more of a novelty than something that I'm going to be spending all of my time playing.
Right. It's Labo VR isn't really like a platform, or never became one. It wasn't intended to be one, particularly, given the fact that there's no head strap included with it. So you can only hold it up to your face for so long. But as you were kind of touching on, like, we did see Nintendo dabble a little bit with it, with, not just the core Labo kit, but Breath of the Wild, added support for Smash Brothers, Captain Toad, which is awesome, by the way. Both that and Zelda I really enjoyed in VR, despite how short Captain Toad's missions were. And yeah, it's interesting that, we're finally seeing Nintendo kind of realize, or we finally saw Nintendo realize to some degree the vision they presumably had for the Virtual Boy. Technology is finally caught up. Even if Labo, of course, still has its own limitations, Nintendo really leaned into what it was and made it work for me on a level that's at least fun as a novelty. But I would love to see Nintendo, as you said, go even farther with the idea, like make full games from the ground up with VR in mind. Because I've already had a blast with with basically what are tech demos in Labo VR. I've really enjoyed it just being added on as an additional layer in the games I just mentioned, like Zelda. I played the entirety of Zelda Breath of the Wild in VR, and I loved it. But it would be so fun.
I played like an hour or two and was like, well, that was cool.
But yeah, I would really love to see what Nintendo could do with a from the ground up game made for it, like Mario in VR. Like, what does Mario look like in proper virtual reality that isn't the complete throwaway mode they made for Labo, which I actually didn't like. I hated what they did for Mario Odyssey.
I think Mario Odyssey's VR stuff is the most disappointing thing, and it's crazy because I feel like Mario Odyssey is the game that could probably do the coolest VR thing.
Exactly, yeah. I do like how Mario Odyssey is one of the wildest concepts for a Mario game, where he's like basically body snatching. Then it has the most conventional, boring use of VR possible.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what they were thinking. So yeah, my hope is that Nintendo leans into it even more. Perhaps if there's a second revision or Switch 2 or whatever, better screen resolution. Maybe they'll make a a non-cardboard version of a headset with proper motion track controllers, for instance. I think there's a lot Nintendo could do, and I hope that they continue to explore the space. And it's for that reason that I hope that VR continues to grow as a marketplace. But I just want to see what Nintendo can do with it.
Yeah.
That'd be enjoyable to see. Now, before we move on to the questions we have from some readers here, or some viewers, readers, I'm stuck in Nintendo Power era. Do you have any final points about the Virtual Boy you'd like to bring up yourself that we haven't addressed yet?
No, I think we basically covered it.
Wario
Land is great. Everything else,
it really is.
Fun.
I had heard it was good, and I was surprised by how much fun I was having playing it, even again with how uncomfortable the Virtual Boy is as a system. And I guess there's one more question I want to bring up to you real quick. Why is it specifically, do you think it is a Virtual Boy failed? I know we've kind of touched on it in a wide spectrum, but why is it that the Virtual Boy kind of just fell out of the gate as a failure,
I think it wasn't a complete system. Like that's kind of the main thing, is that like Nintendo got to a point where they basically forced it out.
Right.
And I think it's the same reason. It's maybe it's a more extreme reason. Maybe it's a more extreme example of why VR in general hasn't taken off to a huge degree. Is that it's like seeing is believing with it. Like, you actually need to like get in and play this thing to be able to like understand the magic of VR. And I think, like there are things like I remember playing Res Infinite in VR, and like that was mind blowing to me. Like not go out and drop all the money to get a VR headset mind blowing, but it was mind blowing. It was super cool. And there's a lot of other things that I've seen in VR that it's just like that's really neat. Like, that sounds cool. Like Half-Life Alyx, have not played, but the concept of that game, like, that seems pretty cool. And Virtual Boy, outside of Wario Land being great, which isn't really dependent on Virtual Boy as a platform, like that game would have been fine on Game Boy probably. Like Nintendo, I feel like with the Virtual Boy just wasn't able to really showcase like the necessity of why this thing had to be and why it had to be so awkward. Like, and maybe that second wave of games would have done that. I don't blame Nintendo for a second that they cut bait when they did, because especially when they were looking at the launch of the Nintendo 64 in 1996, having the Virtual Boy out there, likely failing even if Bound High and Dragon Hopper came out. Like, that would have been a bad look in an era that they still kind of got their butts kicked by PlayStation. I think it would have actually reflected upon them even worse, in the same way that I think there's an argument to be made that I think the Wii U's failure dragged down the 3DS over that era. I don't blame Nintendo for cutting bait when they did, but as far as like why it's a failure, like I just think they didn't have that killer app that only could have been done on the Virtual Boy. And
it didn't have its Mario 64.
Yeah. Like, there wasn't something that justified the existence of, or the reason for the system. There was nothing there that could really justify it. And they couldn't hang their hat on anything. Because if you look at Nintendo consoles, and it's something that I don't think one game will make or break a system, but being able to show off Mario 64, like, that's kind of a big deal. Like, even GameCube, I mean, yeah, Luigi's Mansion might not have been the most exciting tech demo, but you did have, like, Super Smash Bros. Melee, and Sunshine, and Metroid Prime, and Wind Waker all kind of shown off in that launch window. And I think that's also an example of the fact that there's not a singular game on GameCube, probably why that didn't do as well either. And then with Wii, it's Wii Sports. With Switch, it was Breath of the Wild, initially. And you need that to make a system, succeed. And when it's an unconventional system, you need that to hit even harder.
Good point. Yeah, I think you brought up, I think the biggest issue with it, as you said, is you can't convey what it is fully in ads. It's a black and red system that is focused on the 3D. That's not going to look impressive when you show it on TV or in print ads, especially when you compare it to its upcoming contemporaries like the PlayStation and Saturn, where you're starting to see these full 3D games, and of course later with Mario 64, or I guess even by that point, probably Mario 64, not long after, which look amazing, and then you have like these wireframe 3D models at best, which again don't look good, and there's no way to convey the things that the Virtual Boy does do well without having people actually try it themselves, and the manner in which to do so was pretty limited. Outside of trade shows, you had the Blockbuster kiosks I mentioned earlier, or maybe a few kiosks at stores like Target, or you could try renting it, but even doing so, like, it doesn't impress that much, you know? Like, it wasn't good enough to warrant even picking up once you did try it, because the 3D is overall pretty subtle, I think, with a few exceptions. It just didn't add anything to the gameplay. Like, it was neat as a novelty, but as you were saying, even Wario Land, its standout title, doesn't need the 3D. It would still work without it, even if it is better with it. So yeah, that's one of the biggest problems with the Virtual Boy. And it's interesting to see how Nintendo struggled with this over and over, seemingly. Like, again, on the 3DS, like, made 3D the focal point. No one cared really at first, to the point that you not only did have to drop the price, offer an ambassador program for people who did pick it up, then they even, like, just got rid of the 3D eventually entirely, where some games didn't even have 3D, Yeah, like, at this point, I actually went back and I've been playing some Ocarina of Time 3D, although I've been playing it in 2D, because I have a 2DS XL. That's the 3DS that I'm going back to. I'm not going back to the 3D games, and I think the stereoscopic 3D on 3DS is really neat, but it's just that it's not necessary. There's like Super Mario 3D Land, I think, is the only game where, like, you could make the argument that, like, okay, you're missing content by not being in 3D. But even that, like, it's neat. It's not necessary. Yeah, and I would say even that I would almost say the 3D effect is more impressive on the 3DS, just because you have that frame of reference of it, of it typically being a flat display, and you're still looking at what is a flat display, but you're seeing depth within it, and that's kind of magic. Whereas a Virtual Boy just looking to a black box, and also the fact that the backgrounds are typically just black by their nature. There's not a whole lot of contrast there, so yeah. Like, I have a lot of memories of seeing the 3DS for the first time, and that was watching magic. Like, that screen, even the weird looking Taco original 3DS, like, looking at that back when it was first revealed, and launch day games, even some of the rough launch of the 3DS, like, looking at those games in 3D was so cool, and it felt like it couldn't happen, and it was. Yeah, that's it. Like, it impressed as a tech demo at the very least. Even if the novelty did wear off eventually. Whereas a Virtual Boy, it didn't quite to even that extent. But that's not even get into all the other issues we've mentioned. We didn't even touch on the fact that it took 6 AA batteries like the Game Gear, and I don't think it lasted. I think it lasted at least longer than the Game Gear, but not as long as the Game Gear. I don't know, because I've never played it not plugged into an AC. Good point. Oh, actually, fun fact real quick, though. Perhaps one of the nice things about the Virtual Boy is its power supply, which oddly connects to the controller, by the way, a weird little thing. It uses the same power supply as a Super Nintendo. So if you lose the Virtual Boy, it's just you grab your Super Nintendos, and there you go. Alright, well, now that we've talked pretty much every aspect of the Virtual Boy that we can, I think we have a few questions here that might address a few final points. From Jan the Man, they ask, did you get any eye strain or migraines at all from staring at it? If so, how long did it take you before symptoms set in? So Neil, do you recall any, like, eye strain from using the Virtual Boy? I've never really had that much. Like, I think the worst problem that I've had while playing it is that you get the uncomfortable indentation from, like, the eye shield thing, as opposed to any actual eye strain. Maybe that's because, I've worn glasses since I was in 4th grade. I usually just take them off when I'm playing Virtual Boy. I don't know if that, like, helps or hurts. I'm nearsighted, so maybe that has something to do with it. I have no idea, but I've had friends who have played my Virtual Boy who have been like, oh, like, I can't do it for that long. For me, it's never bothered me, although probably the longest I probably, like, played Wario Land for an hour. Every other time I've played it has been more, like, sub-half-hour bursts at the most. Right. Yeah, I think, I agree with you. I've never had eye strain from the Virtual Boy. Usually it's some other part of my body giving out before my eyes can. So yeah, I never found that to be that big of an issue. Isaac asks, how would you feel about Switch Collection or a Virtual Boy Nintendo Online? Would it be worth having an alternative way of playing these games? So I'd love that, but realistically, like,
why would Nintendo do that?
Yeah.
Like, I want it, but like in a world where we just have the NES and the Super Nintendo on Nintendo Switch Online right now, like, there are a lot of other systems I think they should go to, and Virtual Boy is not next on the list, that's for sure.
I know, you're definitely right. It just upsets me because they have the perfect platform now with Labo VR, as we touched on earlier, finally bring these games back for a new audience, and they're not going to do it. So, that's sad.
I really, like, before Labo VR came out, I was like, they could do it. Like, they could put those in there. And then I heard, like, maybe it was even from you, I don't know, that, like, there was a little Mario's Tennis Easter egg. And that, like, it was just, like, you can watch someone go and put their face in the Virtual Boy. And you can watch the game, but you can't play it.
Nope. Furio5113 asks, is it worth getting one nowadays for the novelty? I'd like to own one. What do you think, Neil?
It depends on the price. That would be, like, I have not checked the Virtual Boy market, but if you got one for $600 last year, it went up a lot. That's a 600% increase from 10 years ago.
Yeah,
maybe I should sell mine. So if you're interested in buying my Virtual, no. But I think it really depends on how much disposable income you have and how much you can find one for. Like, if you can find a reasonable price for a system and you're really curious, why not? But I would not break the bank or sell kidneys to go play Wario Land.
Yeah, it's fun as a novelty. Don't buy it if you're, as an actual platform. So, especially at $600, I can promise you that, or assure you that. Shocksta asks, how do you guys feel about Wario Land being claimed as the best Virtual Boy game? How do you think it stacks up to the originals if you've ever played them? So I've never actually played too much of the Wario Land games myself. Like, I've dabbled in them here and there. So perhaps you can speak more to this, Neil. I will say, though, from what I played of Wario Land Virtual Boy, not only is it probably by far my favorite Virtual Boy game that I've played so far, it's probably the most I've been hooked on a Wario Land game as well. But again, I haven't played the full series, so... I
don't even think it's a contest. It's the best Virtual Boy game. Like that is done. That is it. As far as in the context of the Wario Land series, I think I would say it's better than the first one. Mm-hmm. I think 2 and 3 are probably better. Maybe it's on, like, if I were to do a Wario Land ranking, although I guess Shake It would probably... I love Shake It. But I think 2 and 3 are probably the two best, especially of that era. And maybe I'd put Virtual Boy Wario Land on the same wavelength as, like, Wario Land 4. But like, some of that does factor in, and that the novelty of it being on Virtual Boy. I think on, like, if all of these games were, like, on Game Boy Advance for some reason, it probably would be, better than the first Wario Land, but maybe not better than the later ones. But it's totally good. Like, I think all of the Wario Land games, in general, are a baseline good. It just depends on how good, and I do think, like 2, 3, and Shake It are definitely better than the Virtual Boy one.
But what's fun about the Virtual Boy 1 is, unless I'm mistaken, I don't think I am, is it even has some unique gameplay elements you won't find in the others.
Yeah.
Partially because of the 3D. So it's fun that it even holds up to this day in some novel ways. Gamer Letter asks, do you believe that the Virtual Boy was released later on and had more time put into it, along with a better launch lineup, could have had a chance at success?
I don't think so.
Yeah,
like, I think maybe it lasts longer. Like maybe, like, I mean, let's ponder the alternate reality where, like, Nintendo 64 was ready by 95. I think that's the kind of thing that reverberates across the industry, and maybe Nintendo does better in that generation. If Mario 64 was as good as it was in 96 and came out in 95, that could have, not let PlayStation have that insurmountable lead that they wound up having by the time N64 got cooking. But, I mean, Nintendo kind of made a lot of other mistakes to lead up to that area, like alienate every third-party developer, and go with cartridges. But let's say if, like, Virtual Boy did come out in, like, 96 or 97, had some more time, maybe a Bound High or a Dragon Hopper, or that Zero Racers, maybe that's around the launch window. Maybe it's a little bit better. I still think that either way, Pokemon was coming, and I don't think Pokemon was going to fly on Virtual Boy. So I think it might have been a weird thing where maybe Virtual Boy, like, lasts for, like, 2-3 years, and I think somehow, bizarrely, Game Boy would still outlast it. Because, I mean, Pokemon was 95 or 96 in Japan, So that was like full-blown, like, America was licking its chops to bring the phenomenon of Pokemon over in '98. I think that even if Virtual Boy wound up, like, maybe eking out a couple million unit sales, lasting for a couple of years, I still think Game Boy surpasses it, and Virtual Boy's still, like, that weird blip, just not as much of a failure.
Yeah, I think you pretty much hit on the head. Like, I think the Virtual Boy was just kind of destined to fail. I don't think there's... So actually, maybe I'm taking a slightly harsher angle than you are. I think it could have lasted longer, but I don't think there's a universe in which Virtual Boy could have worked. I mean, look, as I said earlier, we're 25 years later. Virtual reality is only now becoming a thing. Even then, it's struggling, right? Like, it's growing, but slowly, and that's with, you know, companies worth billions like Facebook working on it, several developers investing into it, and even now, like, it's tough making inroads, just because, you know, I think there's just for as cool as virtual reality can be, there's also just an inherent thing that's not particularly appealing about it either, you know? Like, I have an Oculus Quest, I love it, or I like it for it being, you know, wireless, it being completely portable, you know, it's probably the most elegant virtual reality system there is out there, but still, it's like, you know, most of the time, like, do I really want to stick my head in this thing, you know, and I don't. And if you look back to 95 again, technology was so much inferior to what it is now, that even had it had a color display, I just don't see how it could have worked, especially when you have games like Mario 64 coming out on the 64, which it's kind of funny to look back at now with how the Virtual Boy and 64 were both approaching 3D in quotes in their own different ways. Nintendo 64 with 3D worlds, Virtual Boy in pretty much a, you know, quasi 3D stereoscopic manner, which is pretty different. And yeah, I just don't see the Virtual Boy succeeding, you know? Like, you got Mario 64, you can do whatever you want. Virtual Boy's like, yeah, you can play tennis, and there's some depth to it.
Hey, but there could have been a 2D Mario with some top-down Zelda segments.
I know, cool. Man, I'm still disappointed we didn't get that Virtual Boy Mario. Bums me out. Alright, Critter XD asks, is it better than Labo VR? Neil?
No. I mean, like... Wario Land is better than Labo VR. I think the totality of the system, I think Labo VR is better.
I'd agree with that, except I would put Wario Land on equal level with Labo VR. Yeah. I really love Labo VR, so.
Although, yeah, I mean, thinking about it more, I think Labo VR, with the fact that, like, you can play Breath of the Wild in it. No, I'll give the edge to Labo VR even over Wario Land, because, like, thinking of Labo VR just as a singular product with the game that comes with it,
right.
Like, I think Wario Land is better, but if you keep the scope of, like, I bought Labo VR and I can also play Captain Toad and Breath of the Wild in it, and even that bad Odyssey thing, that makes it a more compelling package.
Right. Deoxys asks, if you could remake any game from Virtual Boy for Nintendo Switch or Labo VR, which game would you choose? I think it has to be Wario Land, right?
Yeah, no, that's it.
Yeah. Chiphead asks, if there was one Nintendo franchise you think that would have been neat to see on the Virtual Boy, what would it be and why? It can be something big like Zelda and Metroid, or something more obscure like Excite Bike or Mach Rider.
I mean, it's a Mario Land game.
Yeah, I think I did, exactly, I agree. Mario is the one to showcase how systems work, and for as much as I like Mario Tennis, and that even though I said it's a good pack-in title earlier, it's not a Mario game. I mean, it's tennis with Mario, I wanted a Mario game.
So I think my thing, if I think about just like at least what the Virtual Boy was kind of kicking at a little bit, I would have loved to have seen a full-blown Star Fox game on Virtual Boy. I think that could have been really neat, and Red Alarm kind of got there, and I don't know how you necessarily solve some of the problems in Red Alarm on Virtual Boy, but I think there is actually a tech demo that involved an R-Wing on the Virtual Boy, so maybe this was a thought that occurred. And I think the idea of Teleraboxer is really cool. It would have been cooler if that was just straight up a Punch-Out game.
Right.
That would have been neat.
Yeah.
But other than that, top-down Zelda game in it. Like, that would have been really cool. And they were kind of working on that. Like, Dragon Hopper from Intelligent Systems
there you go.
Looked like it was going to be that sort of game. Like, and I wish some of these games got finished. Zero Races.
I know, I agree. This is like an era of gaming we're probably never going to get back. Like, just how weird some of these games were and seem to be, and we're never going to see them, and that kind of saddens me. Yeah. Francisco asks, I rented one from Blockbuster when it launched and wasn't impressed with it. Only Nintendo console completely passed on. And yeah, I think that's kind of the biggest problem with it, beyond just the marketing factor, is it's just not all that impressive, you know? Like, you can see the best thing about the Virtual Boy in a single weekend of playing it from renting it at Blockbuster. Why would you spend, at the time, you know, what was nowadays $300 for it, especially when, you know, there was 14 games at max in the US.
Yeah.
You know,
I think there's 22 worldwide.
Yep.
That's it.
RCW says, I have a question. Why are we discussing the Virtual Boy in 2020? Weren't you listening to the beginning of this discussion, RCW? Jeez.
Go back in time,
Yep,
change
exactly.
your tweet. No.
Ahmed asks, is the controller any good? I always liked how it looked. I mean, we already kind of touched on this, but yeah, it's actually pretty neat. I mean, it still feels kind of like modern. Like, if you swapped out, you know, it has fewer buttons and D-pads, of course, but if you swap out the D-pads for control sticks, it would feel, you know, add a few more buttons. It's actually pretty modern, so...
Yeah, I mean, the D-pad is better than the one on the Switch.
God, isn't that the case? Optimal position, too, for it. Like, these are back in the day when the D-pad's a primary input, so it's a comfortable space for it.
Yeah. I think what is really good about the controller is that you're not looking at it while you're playing it, and it's designed in a way that, like, it's very intuitive, because I think that's part of the reason why they replicated the design. Like, it's a symmetrical controller in a way, because, like, the button placements, you're not going to need to look down. It's basically you have D-pad, 2 buttons below it, and then the triggers, and that's basically it.
Yeah.
And, like, it's not confusing while you're, you know, have your face knee deep into the Virtual Boy headset.
The interesting thing is, do you hold your controller the same way I did, where you position your hands behind the system, behind the stand?
Yes, like, you know, like where I'm like hugging the system.
Yeah, exactly. Which is actually pretty fitting to the ad where, like, the Virtual Boy's trying to rope you in again with this power cord. We have I think there's a comment from Gold Pop Tart who says, "Oh my god, I love my Virtual Boy, LOL. I have a complete North American library of it, except the Jack Bros. Honestly, Andre, I just want to know your opinions. If you need to borrow any for test purposes, because I know some games are hard and expensive to come by, I would be happy to lend them." Well, thank you, Gold Pop Tart. I actually may take you up on that offer, but I have been considering doing more retrospective stuffs. Actually, I was totally caught by surprise by the Japanese anniversary. I wanted to do more for it, and I still might for the American one, but I randomly looked up the date today. I'm like, oh crap, it came out tomorrow, or at the time of this recording, tomorrow in Japan? I better record this discussion now. So yeah. We have a comment. So yeah. So hopefully, Gold Pop Tart. We offered enough of our opinions to satiate you. Jonathan asks, "Yeah, why the heck is the 3D effect actually superior to that effect on the 3DS? It has so much freaking depth." So that's interesting, because we actually, or at least I kind of thought it was the almost not opposite, but I felt it was stronger on the 3DS. And did you agree with me, Neil, on that one?
I think I agree with that, but I also see. I think it's the kind of thing that the 3DS always gave you the option, whereas the Virtual Boy is like, no, this is the system. So you're almost forced to being like, no, the depth is always a part of this concept. It's always a part of the system. But I remain more impressed by the 3DS, just because I think the Virtual Boy is less magical than the 3DS to me.
You know, there is actually a good point to this. I feel like, so I mentioned that we've been playing Kid Icarus Uprising for our new game club series. It's basically like a book
excellent
club
game.
For games. Yeah, I've been having fun with it, and I commented how I think one thing that game does in particular, and I would say perhaps most of the 3D library, is it treats 3D intentionally in a more subtle way, where it's an extension of the world, kind of like how Avatar, the movie, the Avatar movie treated it in the same way, where things aren't jumping out of your face. It's more like there's a whole world, but yeah, exactly, there's a world beyond the screen, and that's cool, and that's how like Kid Icarus Uprising specifically worked. Whereas a Virtual Boy, I would actually say, is probably more in your face more often than not, as I kind of commented on with the Wario Land boss fight, where they're throwing things at your face. Mario Tennis, the ball's coming right at you. So I can kind of see where that person's coming from, where it does kind of feel more intentionally 3D than the 3DS often was.
It's like the concept of like, do you want it to be a diorama, or do you want it to be like something that's entering your world?
Exactly. That's a good way of looking at it. Yeah, Halatin says it was in the background of a Seinfeld episode. I did not know that! It's also, oh god, what is it? I don't even think it's there. Where was it in Disney World?
Wait,
did they, so, at Epcot, they had like a section of video games with like Sega systems. Was Virtual Boy
no. So
there?
it was like a recorded video, probably from the '90s at Disney World. It was either in Disney Quest before it closed down. Like, there might have been, I think there was something where, like, you created your own roller coaster. There might have been, like, a Virtual Boy in the back. Or it might have even been something where, like, you, like, cut to this person in their room and they're, like, playing the Virtual Boy and they pull away and they're like, hey, what's up? You here to make a roller coaster? I think it might have been something that was in Disney Quest, or it was something in, like, Innoventions. Or is that what it's called in Epcot? It might have been something there, but I have a memory of just like I basically did the Leo DiCaprio from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood when I was on that ride, just like, oh, there it is.
Interesting. I went to Disney World a ton as a kid. Never saw it there, so that's kind of fun that that it was there at some point. I'm a little upset that I missed it. So combining my two passions, Nintendo and Disney World. Imran Khan asks, why? Because we can, Imran.
Yeah.
That's why.
It's a part of Nintendo history, and we don't just cover all the good stuff, we cover the failures, too.
I guess the final question we have here, and it's something we've, again, addressed a few times already, but this is specific. Dan Palmer asks, compared to modern-day headsets, which are obviously more I'm having trouble with the word, more sophisticated, what features of VR did Nintendo actually get right in the 90s? So that actually is a good question, because in some ways it is surprising just how similar Virtual Boy can be. Like the basic form factor or basic headset idea of it looks similar to how things are these days. I was surprised that it has a pupil slider, so you can adjust you know, the distance between the screens just like you can in modern headsets. It has the
eye shield as well.
Yeah, the eye shield, exactly.
Fumbling at that term, I think that's it.
Yeah, and so which also is similar to how they work these days. Even Labo VR has, you know, its cardboard version. And then even too, like, even though I mentioned the screen itself doesn't feel that big these days, they were trying to go for offering this immersive viewpoint with the fact, as we touched on earlier, it's like all black. It offers like this infinity level appearance to it. So even though the actual display is pretty small, they were trying to offer something as expansive as modern VR does. You know, albeit nowhere near to the same degree, but they were going for it, and I appreciate that. Is there anything else you can think of, Neil, specifically, that they were kind of touching on the modern day headsets do as well?
I'd be curious to know what the weight comparison is between Virtual Boy and modern headsets. I assume the modern ones are probably heavier, but I mean, it's the kind of thing that it's what every non-Nintendo headset kind of gets right, is that the fact that you need to plant your face inside of it and you can't like attach it to your head at all, which there is like Nintendo's paranoia of like kids are gonna run in the streets wearing it. But like it is the kind of thing like that just limits the capabilities, because you kind of have to play it on the system's terms and not your own. Even like thinking about the DIY ways that some people made Labo VR work for them, where they could attach it to their head, because it does make like playing stuff like Zelda kind of difficult. Like, I think I legitimately, like, laid down on my back with my Labo VR on my head to play Zelda on it.
Yeah, I use my armrest in my office chair as supports, before I eventually did buy a strap for it, and I use that now. I guess there is one other thing that the Virtual Boy, that actually surprised me about the Virtual Boy, that reminded me of modern headsets, and that's once I stopped using it and returned to the real world. I had that weird, like, sense of disconnect that I still have the VR with VR to this day. Like, whenever you're cut off from the outside world long enough, it just feels weird coming back, and Virtual Boy captured that perfectly. I don't know if that's a good thing, but it did kind of nail it. So, alright, Neil, I think that's pretty much it for that we have here. Is there anything else you want to mention, like any lasting impression of the Virtual Boy you want to share with our audience before we wrap it up here?
Let's all cross our fingers and hope that someday Nintendo remasters Wario Land.
Please,
we can all play it.
Like, especially like, I mean, make it in color too. Like, they have to offer an original Virtual Boy mode, but also just give us a color version too.
Yeah, like do like an enhanced remake. Like, what's Grezzo doing? They're doing. I mean, honestly, what's Grezzo doing? I hope they're remaking the Oracle games in the same style as Link's Awakening.
Exactly.
But they could totally like give that like a fresh art style, expand upon the game a little bit, because it's. I mean, for Virtual Boy terms, like, that game is an eternity, but it is, I think there's only like 10-15 stages or something like that. Like, it's overall not that long of a game. Like beef that game up, give it some more flair, but then still like basically acknowledge the best thing of your biggest failure. Like,
yep.
Will Nintendo do that? Probably not, but we can all dream.
And if they do, which they won't, please offer Labo VR support, which I know they also won't, but that'd be amazing. So, alright, so that's our retrospective on the Virtual Boy. Thank you so much for joining me, Neil. I'm glad I could find someone as passionate about the platform as I was, or as I have been. Where can people find you at, though, if they want to read more things from Neil Ronaham?
You can check me out. I'm over at NintendoWorldReport.com. We've been around for almost as long as the Virtual Boy, since 1999, which is weird. But yeah, I'm over at NintendoWorldReport.com. We also have a YouTube channel, Nintendo World Report TV. You can support us over on Patreon at patreon.com/NWR or something along those lines. And if you just want to see what I'm talking about, you want to ask me questions about the Virtual Boy, you can find me on Twitter at NRON10, NRON10. And I hope this was educational for everybody. And we all think a lot more about Nintendo's failures and how they're still fun, even in failure.
That is 100% true, and it feels like there's a saying about Disney, how they never, or the Imagineers at Disney, how like they never get rid of like a good idea, like they always keep it on hand. And I feel like that's kind of the same way with Nintendo too, where you can see like echoes of their past and even modern day products, and that continues with like with Labo VR and how it kind of echoes what the Virtual Boy was going for, and that's always fun to me. Anyways, you'll find links to everything that Neil mentioned in the description below, and likewise, if you'd like to subscribe to GameSplay and you haven't already, click that subscribe button for tons more, possibly on the Virtual Boy if I get around to making more features for the American anniversary coming up in just a month, God, and everything else Nintendo as well. We'll catch you later. Bye, everyone.
Bye.